For months, my fiancé and his mother had me believing that I was the one overreacting about his ex and her son, until I found out he had been blatantly lying to me, even on Valentine's Day. Now they're trying to make me feel crazy for refusing to accept that they keep seeing each other behind my back. I met Brennan at a party I didn't want to attend. It was one of those gatherings hosted by a mutual friend that you agree to go to because you've spent weeks without going out, and the guilt of not being social starts to outweigh the desire to stay home. I arrived late, barely knew anyone, and was just about to come up with an excuse to leave when someone behind me apologized for brushing against my shoulder as they walked by. I turned around, and it was him. I'm not going to romanticize that moment because it wasn't cinematic. He was just a man apologizing for something I had barely felt, with a smile that wasn't trying to make an impression but somehow did anyway. We talked for 3 straight hours that night, about unimportant things at first and then about things that mattered, and by the time I walked back to my car, it was 2 in the morning, and I had exchanged my number with someone for the first time in over a year. Brennan was 28 when we met. He worked in logistics for a construction company, lived alone in a tidy apartment that smelled like coffee and wood, and had that specific quality possessed by people who genuinely listen, not people who are simply waiting for their turn to speak, but people who process what you've said before responding. More than anything else, that's what drew me to him. He listened to me. For the first few months, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. We went out 2 or 3 times a week, I met his friends, and he met mine. He was thoughtful without being overbearing, funny without trying to be, and had a way of showing up when I needed him that didn't require me to explicitly ask. 4 months in, he told me about Renata for the first time. Not in a dramatic way. He mentioned her in the context of a story about his past, the way people bring up exes when they're no longer emotional baggage but simply part of the story that shaped who they are. They had dated for almost 3 years. She had a son from a previous relationship, a boy named Marco, who was 4 years old when Renata and Brennan started dating, which meant he had grown up with Brennan present during a significant part of his childhood. He told me that when they broke up, it had been difficult precisely because of the boy, because Marco kept asking about him, and that carried a weight that a breakup between 2 adults without children simply doesn't have. He said they had ended things on good terms, without drama, and that there was no dark story behind it. I believed him. There was no visible reason not to. What he didn't tell me that night, or on any of the nights that followed, was the part I gradually discovered in fragments over time, that his relationship with Renata wasn't simply a closed chapter. It was an open line that was still active, maintained by his mother on one end and by him on the other, in a way that nobody had decided I needed to know about. The first sign came 6 months after we started dating. We were at his mother Claudia's house one Sunday afternoon. She had cooked a meal and invited a few other family members over. It was only the 3rd or 4th time I'd been there, and my relationship with Claudia was still in that polite testing phase where both sides are friendly because they're trying to figure out where things are headed. Claudia's phone rang halfway through the afternoon. She checked it, smiled in a way that didn't include me, and stepped into the hallway. She stayed out there for about 10 minutes. When she came back, she said something quietly to Brennan, and the two of them exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second, but I noticed it. Later, when we were alone in the car on the way home, I asked Brennan who had called his mother. He said it was a friend. He answered with the specific kind of casualness that comes from preparing an answer before the question is asked, which is different from the casualness of someone who is simply telling the truth. I didn't press the issue. I tucked the question away somewhere in the back of my mind and moved on with the evening. But unexplained gestures have a tendency to accumulate, and that was the first piece of something much larger that would take me a long time to see in full. The proposal came 2.5 years into our relationship. It happened at a restaurant we had visited on our first official date, a choice that struck me as thoughtful in a way that affected me more than I expected. I said yes without hesitation because, at that moment, I had no real doubts. What came afterward, the period between the engagement and what eventually happened, is the part I struggle most to reconstruct honestly because it requires admitting that there were things I didn't want to see even when they were right in front of me. After the engagement, I spent more time at Claudia's house. It was inevitable. Wedding planning involves family in ways you don't always choose but accept because they are part of the process. Claudia was a woman with strong opinions and a way of presenting them that made it difficult to tell when she was making a suggestion and when she was making a decision. She was intelligent, organized, and had a level of influence over Brennan that I noticed gradually, not as something threatening at first, but simply as the dynamic of a family where the mother had long been the central figure. What I began noticing more closely throughout those months was something more specific. Claudia mentioned Marco with a frequency that didn't fit the narrative that Renata was simply part of the past. Not directly. She never mentioned Renata by name in front of me, at least not during those first few months. But she would say things like how quickly the boy was growing up, or how incredible it was how children change at that age, or how kids sometimes need stability from the adults who have been important in their lives. She said it casually, woven into broader conversations, in a way that made pointing it out seem like an overreaction on my part. One night, I asked Brennan directly whether he was still in contact with Renata. He said no. He told me that his mother occasionally spoke with her because of the child, that he understood it was something Claudia had maintained on her own, and that it wasn't something that involved him directly. I asked him whether he thought it was normal for his mother to maintain that relationship. He said his mother was just like that she grew attached to people, and that it wasn't something he could or wanted to control. It wasn't an answer that convinced me, but on the surface it sounded reasonable enough that pushing the issue more aggressively would have seemed, as Brennan suggested through his tone if not his words, like a disproportionate reaction on my part. I started doubting myself. That's what is hardest for me to admit now. There was a period when I genuinely didn't know whether what I was feeling was a correct perception of something real or simply an insecurity without any concrete basis. Brennan was good to me in every visible aspect of our relationship. There was no emotional distance, no signs of disinterest, none of the obvious indicators people associate with a relationship in trouble. What there were, however, were small things that could each be explained individually, but together formed something I didn't know how to name. The second major sign came in February, on Valentine's Day. That morning, Brennan told me he had a few errands to run on his way home after work. He said he had something to pick up, that he'd be a little late, but that our dinner reservation was for 8 o'clock, so there wouldn't be any problem. He said it casually, without any visible tension. At 6 that evening, I checked his location. We had been sharing our locations with each other for months for practical reasons, with no intention of monitoring one another. He was at an address I recognized. I had seen it before on the map a few weeks earlier when he had spent longer there than a quick errand would justify. I looked up the address. It was the house of Renata's grandparents. I waited without saying anything that afternoon. He arrived with flowers and the same good mood he always had. He kissed me on the cheek and asked if I was ready to go out. During dinner, he was present and attentive in the way he always was. On the drive home, I asked how his errands had gone. He described 2 stops. One at a hardware store, another at a friend's house nearby, where he had picked up some tools he had lent him months earlier. He told the story with the level of detail that truthful stories tend to have, neither too much nor too little. I told him I had checked his location. There was a brief silence. I asked him about the 3rd stop. He said he had stopped by Renata's grandparents' house because he happened to be in the area and had seen them outside. He said he had stopped for a few minutes to say hello, that it was nothing, that it had been spontaneous, that he hadn't thought it was something worth mentioning. I told him it was Valentine's Day and that he had lied by omission about where he had been. He said he hadn't lied, that he simply hadn't mentioned it because he hadn't considered it relevant. That distinction, between lying and not mentioning something, consumed the rest of that night and part of the following weeks. It was a distinction Brennan defended with a consistency that, over time, I began to recognize as practiced. After that night, the issue settled into an uncomfortable space that neither of us ever fully resolved. Brennan apologized for not mentioning the stop, said he understood why the timing made it feel worse, and promised to be more transparent. I accepted that apology because, at the time, I still wanted to believe it was enough. Over the following weeks, I did something I hadn't done before. I started actively paying attention to patterns. Not obsessively, and not by tracking every movement, but with the particular attentiveness of someone who has realized that certain things happen in the margins of what is said out loud and needs to understand how much space they actually occupy. What I observed was this: Claudia and Brennan talked about Marco with a frequency that didn't match the description of occasional contact. I never directly saw their phones or overheard complete conversations, but I noticed the absences, the moments when Brennan checked his phone and subtly shifted his posture, the times when Claudia mentioned the boy with a level of detail that required recent information. One Tuesday that month, Brennan's dog died. His name was Atlas. He had owned him before meeting Renata, and the dog had lived with them throughout the 3 years they were together. Brennan was genuinely devastated, and I stayed by his side that day. I accompanied him to the veterinarian, brought him home, and stayed with him. That evening, while Brennan was in the shower, his phone lit up on the table with a message. I didn't intentionally read it, but the name that appeared on the screen before it went dark was Renata. When Brennan came out of the bathroom, I told him I had seen that Renata had texted him. He nodded. He said she had sent a message about Atlas because she had heard he had died, that it was normal because the dog had lived with them, that it was simply a condolence message and nothing more. I asked him how she had found out. He said his mother had probably told her. I asked whether he and Renata communicated regularly. He said not regularly, that sometimes, every few months, they exchanged messages to see how Marco was doing. I pointed out that it was essentially the same thing he did with the grandparents. That if his mother also spoke with Renata regularly, then there were multiple lines of communication open with the same person, all operating in parallel, none of which I fully knew about. He told me it wasn't as complicated as I was making it out to be. That phrase, "it's not as complicated as you're making it out to be," was what finally made me realize there was a pattern in how Brennan responded whenever I pointed something out. There was always a reasonable explanation. My perception was always the thing being questioned. The problem was always the way I processed the information, never the information itself. The next day, I called Claudia. It wasn't an impulsive decision. I thought about it for several days beforehand, and I did it because I wanted to have a direct conversation with her, without Brennan in the middle, about what I was observing and how I was experiencing it. Claudia listened to me. When I finished speaking, she told me she understood my concerns, but that Marco was a child who had loved her son, that a bond like that didn't simply disappear because a relationship ended, that she, as a grandmother figure even if not a biological one, felt a responsibility toward that child, and that Brennan shared that sense of responsibility even though the situation was complicated. I told her that the child wasn't my issue. My issue was the lack of honesty. I had entered this relationship without knowing there were open lines of communication with Brennan's ex that nobody had considered important enough to mention, and every time I pointed them out, the response was that I was overreacting. Claudia said no one wanted to make me feel that way. That if Brennan hadn't been completely open, it was because he knew I could be difficult about these kinds of things and had wanted to avoid unnecessary conflict. I could be difficult about these kinds of things. I hung up the call with the same feeling I had walked away with from every conversation before it, the feeling that I had entered with a clear argument and somehow left feeling like I was the unreasonable person in the story. I told my friend Priya about everything that had been happening. Priya and I have known each other since college. She's the kind of person who listens to the entire story before offering an opinion, who has no interest in telling you what you want to hear if she doesn't think it's the truth, and who expresses her views directly even when they're uncomfortable. For those exact reasons, I hadn't told her anything until that point. I knew what she would say would be difficult to hear, and I hadn't been ready to hear it. I told her everything from the beginning. Marco being mentioned during the first months. Claudia's phone call that was never explained to me. Valentine's Day. The regularity of the contact. The conversations where my concerns somehow became the problem. Priya listened without interrupting me. When I finished, she sat in silence for a few moments. Then she said, "What you're describing has a name. You're not exaggerating. What's happening is that every time you point out something real, the response is to make you question your own perception. That's not a healthy dynamic, regardless of what's actually going on with the EX." I told her I wasn't sure how serious the situation with Renata really was, that maybe the contact genuinely was exactly what Brennan claimed it was. She said that could be true, but that what was unquestionably true was that Brennan had lied by omission on Valentine's Day, that Claudia had validated that omission, and that when I pointed it out, their response wasn't accountability. Their response was to redirect the problem back onto me. I asked her what she would do if she were in my position. She said she would insist on a conversation where both parties were completely honest about what did and did not exist, without explanations that depended on me accepting that my perception was the problem. That night, I asked Brennan if we could talk. I didn't approach it with accusations or with the full inventory of everything I had been observing. I approached it with a direct question. I wanted him to tell me, without omissions and without the version he thought I could handle, what the reality of the contact between him, his mother, and Renata actually was. Brennan looked at me for a moment. Then he said he had already explained everything. I told him that what he had explained seemed to have different versions depending on when I asked, and that wasn't explaining. It was managing. He said I always found a way to turn this into a bigger problem than it really was. I told him that if honesty was as simple as he claimed, then it shouldn't cost him anything to be completely transparent for once. He stood up. He said he needed some air. He went out onto the balcony and stayed there for 20 minutes. When he came back, he sat down across from me and said this, if my mom and I started being completely honest, would that help our relationship and your relationship with my mom? I stared at him. I asked him what that question was supposed to mean. He said it meant that he wanted us to find a way to move forward together. I told him that the question he had just asked implied that they had not been completely honest up to that point, and that it confirmed exactly what I had been pointing out for months. He didn't respond to that directly. The days that followed that conversation were some of the hardest of the entire ordeal because they were the days when I had to accept, in a real sense and not just as a theoretical possibility, that what I had been observing was not my imagination distorting reality. Brennan hadn't lied in a dramatic way, nor had he constructed an entirely false story. What he had done was more subtle, and therefore harder to name. He had managed information with the goal of giving me access to a version of reality that wouldn't create conflict, and whenever that version was questioned, the response was always to redirect the issue toward the way I process things. Claudia had participated in that process, not necessarily out of malice, but with the logic of someone protecting her son from the consequences of his decisions. That's an understandable instinct and, at the same time, a deeply damaging one for anyone standing on the other side of it. I called Priya and told her about the question Brennan had asked me. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Priya said, "That's not a promise to change. That's a negotiation where he's still setting the terms." She was right. What Brennan had proposed, without saying it explicitly, was an exchange that would be honest if I accepted that honesty in a way that wouldn't create consequences for the situation that already existed. It wasn't an apology. It was a proposal that I adapt myself to the situation once the situation was confirmed. I asked for 3 days to think. Brennan agreed without applying any pressure, which at another time I would have interpreted as respect, but in that moment I interpreted as the confidence of someone who believed I would arrive at the conclusion he expected. During those 3 days, I did something I hadn't done at any previous point in the process. I wrote down everything I had observed in chronological order, without interpretation, just facts and dates. Claudia's unexplained phone call. The mentions of Marco with a level of detail that required recent information. Valentine's Day. Atlas's death and Renata's message. The conversations where my concerns became the problem. Brennan's final question. Seeing it written out that way created a clarity that the real-time conversations never had, because in real time there was always an explanation available, and I always had to decide in the moment whether to accept it. On paper, with no one sitting across from me explaining things away, all that remained was the pattern. On the 3rd day, I told Brennan that I needed us to sit down with a neutral third party, a couples therapist, to have the conversation we had been trying and failing to have on our own. He said he didn't think they needed to go that far, that they could work it out between themselves. I told him that's what we had been trying to do for months, and it hadn't worked. He said that if I went to therapy and told all of this to a third party, that said something about the level of trust one had in him. I recognized that argument. It was the same mechanism as always, turning my response to the problem into the new problem. I told him yes, it did say something. It said that I had reached the limit of what I could handle alone in these conversations and that I needed outside support to create fairness in the process. Brennan was silent for a moment. Then he said he would think about it. That night, he called Claudia. I knew because I overheard part of the conversation from the bedroom. Not the actual words, but the tone. And the tone was that of someone coordinating something with another person, not someone simply telling his mother how his day had gone. The next day, Claudia called me. She said she understood that I was going through a difficult time. She said Brennan loved me, that our engagement was real, and that she wanted it to work out. She said that relationships sometimes require flexibility and understanding from both sides. She said that Brennan's contact with Marco came from the goodness of his heart and that it wasn't a threat to what he had with me. I told her that Marco had never been the issue. She asked me what the issue was then. I told her that the issue was that for months they had been making decisions about what to tell me and what not to tell me, and that every time I pointed that out, the response was that my perception was wrong. Claudia said that nobody had tried to deceive me. I told her I wasn't using the word deception. I was using the word honesty, and those two things were not the same. There was a pause. Then Claudia said, "I hope you can find a way to see this differently." I hung up. I spent that night alone in the apartment because Brennan had gone to a friend's house, something he informed me of by text rather than asking whether I was okay with it. I sat in the living room with the lights dimmed and stayed there for a length of time I never measured, without my phone and without any distractions, simply allowing everything I had been processing in fragments to occupy its full space for the first time. I kept thinking about the question Brennan had asked me, if my mom and I start being honest, would that help? That question had been circling in my head from the moment I heard it because it had a structure that sounded reasonable on the surface but was completely revealing underneath. It wasn't the question of someone who wanted to be honest. It was the question of someone evaluating whether honesty would be beneficial to him, depending on what I was willing to offer in return. I thought about Claudia and the coordinated phone call that had happened the night before. About the way she had entered the conversation with me carrying arguments that were almost exactly tailored to answer what I had said to Brennan the previous evening. That meant the conversation had been prepared. It meant Claudia had arrived with specific talking points because Brennan had given them to her. They weren't being honest with me. They were being strategic. That distinction was what reorganized everything I had been trying to understand for months. The next morning, Brennan came back early. He walked into the apartment with the caution of someone who doesn't know what he's going to find and would prefer the situation to have somehow resolved itself while he was gone. I told him I wanted to talk. We sat down in the living room. I told him I had spent the night thinking and had come to some conclusions that I wanted to share with him honestly, with the same honesty I had been asking of him for months. I told him I could not commit myself to someone whose default response, when confronted about something, was to make the other person question their own perception. That this wasn't a communication flaw or a trust issue on my part. It was a pattern I had observed consistently for long enough that I trusted what I was seeing. I told him I understood that the bond with Marco was real and that it wasn't something I could or wanted to erase. But that bond did not justify the way they had managed information, and that the difference between us was not a matter of interpretation but of concrete facts. I told him that the question he had asked me, about whether honesty would help our relationship, was confirmation that throughout all that time they had been capable of being honest and had chosen not to be. Brennan listened without interrupting me. When I finished, he sat in silence for a moment. Then he said, "I don't want to lose you." I told him that what he didn't want to lose was the version of this relationship in which I accepted the conditions without pointing them out. That wasn't the same thing as not wanting to lose me. He didn't respond to that. I told him I needed time to decide whether I wanted to continue the relationship and that during that time I needed Claudia not to contact me with additional arguments because I had already heard enough from both of them. He nodded. I stood up, gathered my things, and left for Priya's house. I stayed at Priya's house for 4 days. Those 4 days weren't dramatic in the sense of a prolonged emotional crisis. They were more like a process of letting things settle, allowing the sediment to sink to the bottom so I could finally see clearly what remained once there were no more conversations or real-time arguments clouding the view. Priya didn't pressure me toward any particular decision. She gave me space to think and was available whenever I wanted to talk, which is exactly what a person needs in that kind of moment and not always what they receive. On the 3rd day, I told her I thought I knew what I wanted to do. She asked me what it was. I told her I wanted to end the engagement. Not because contact with Marco was inherently unacceptable, but because what had been exposed over those months was something that couldn't be fixed with a promise of future honesty. What had been exposed was Brennan's willingness to manage information instead of sharing it, Claudia's willingness to support that management, and the fact that whenever I pointed it out, the usual response was to make me question myself. Priya said it sounded like a clear decision and that she respected it. I asked her if she thought I was overreacting. She said no, and that the question itself was part of the problem. That the process of the past several months had led me to doubt my own perceptions to the point where I needed someone else to confirm that my conclusions were reasonable. She was right. On the 4th day, I returned to the apartment when I knew Brennan wouldn't be there. I gathered the things that were specifically mine and anything I needed immediately. I left him a note saying that I would call him in the coming days to discuss the practical details and that, for the time being, I needed him to respect my space. That night, from the guest room Priya had lent me, I called my mother. I told her everything. My mother is a direct person and doesn't always tell you what you want to hear, something I found difficult as a teenager but had come to appreciate as an adult. When I finished, she said, "I'm glad you saw it before you were married." She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say it was terrible what had happened to me. She simply said what was true in the most direct way possible. I sat in silence for a moment. Then I said yes, I was glad too. And it was true. In the middle of everything that was difficult to process, that much was true. 3 weeks after leaving Brennan's apartment, I had the conversation I had promised to have. We met at a neutral cafe, mid-morning on a Wednesday, during that quiet window when places are calm and no one is in a hurry. Brennan arrived on time, which was something he had always done and still did, and the continuity of small habits in the context of everything that had changed felt strangely disorienting in a way I couldn't fully name. I told him what I had decided. I told him I didn't want to continue with the engagement. I told him I was explaining why even though he already knew, because it felt like something I owed him and because I needed to say it out loud in full. I told him the problem was never Renata or Marco. The problem was the pattern, the management of information, the responses that turned my observations into the issue, the coordinated conversation with Claudia. That this pattern wasn't something a promise of future honesty could undo because the issue wasn't a lack of honesty going forward, but what the lack of honesty in the past had revealed about how he made decisions when he believed full truth would create conflict. Brennan listened to me. When I finished, he said he understood, that he wasn't going to argue it, that he was sorry. I told him I believed him. He asked if there was any chance things could change. I told him I didn't know for certain, but that at that moment I didn't see how, and that operating from that level of uncertainty wasn't a foundation I could build a commitment on. He nodded. We stood up. Outside the cafe, the day was overcast with that specific winter gray that never quite commits to rain. We hugged briefly, without lingering, and then each of us went in our own direction. I walked to my car and sat inside without starting it for a few minutes. I didn't cry. I had already cried enough in other circumstances, and at that moment what I felt wasn't exactly sadness, but something closer to the clean exhaustion that comes from doing something difficult that needed to be done. I started the car and called Priya on the way home. She picked up on the second ring. I told her it was over, that it had gone as well as these things can go, and that I was on my way. She said she had coffee ready. I told her perfect. That was all. And in that moment, that was enough.